we need to discuss the concept of hybridization. We are at this juncture because as we've explored intermolecular bonding and the formation of molecules, we've learned that electrons are going to be shared between atoms being bonded. That's the origin of the bonds. To share electrons, then, the electron clouds must overlap as the atoms approach each other. But as we've moved further along discussing molecules, in particular molecular geometry, there arises a difficulty in resolving the suborbitals and their orientations with the known geometries that the VSEPR model predicts. How will the overlapping occur while still allowing for the proper geometry? Hybridization attempts to do just that. So what is hybridization? Hybridization is the combining of atomic suborbitals like the ones that you learned about and we discussed in quantum mechanics. That process of combining, the mathematical combining of those suborbitals, is what we call hybridizing. The result of this combination leads to the formation of equivalent molecular orbitals from those combinations. The type of hybridization will provide for the proper spacing and dovetail with that predicted from the use of Lewis dot structures and VSEPR. So there are different kinds of hybridizations that can take place. So let me go through some examples and see what happens in particular molecules and what type of hybridization would be needed to get the proper geometry. Let's begin with methane. Methane is a gas. Its formula is CH4. And here you see its molecular structure. You see its geometry. Hopefully, you readily recognize that it is in a tetrahedral shape. That allows for a 109.5 degree angle to separate the bonding pairs between the carbon and each of the hydrogens. Now, the thing is, let's think about the carbon and hydrogen atoms. First of all, carbon is in the second period on the periodic table. And as a result, we know that that means that its valence electrons are in the second shell. And so they will be found in either 2s or 2p suborbitals. Hydrogen, on the other hand, only has one electron, and it will occupy the 1s orbital. Now, we predicted from VSEPR that we would get a tetrahedron formed. And the VSEPR model would predict that the angle is 109.5 degrees. This has been verified in actual methane molecules. So here we have an agreement between the VSEPR prediction and what a real molecule of methane looks like. But we run into problems pretty quickly because these suborbitals we just looked at for the carbon and the hydrogens, the carbon's 2s and 2p orbitals would suggest we're not going to get a 109.5 degree angle, and we're not going to get equivalent orbitals. We would have two different kinds of overlaps between the hydrogen 1s suborbital and either the 2s or the 2p suborbitals in a carbon atom. We certainly won't get four identical bonds. That would suggest that we've got to come up with a process that will allow for the proper prediction, and that process is hybridization. And so what takes place is the 2s and the 2p suborbitals of the carbon atom are going to be blended mathematically, and they will yield four sp3 orbitals. This is called sp3 hybridization. So anytime we need four equivalent orbitals arranged in a tetrahedral configuration, we would employ sp3 hybridization. Here you see what that looks like. You can see the 2s and then the three 2p suborbitals being combined into 4 equivalent sp3 orbitals. And so when we bring those 4 hydrogens to the carbon atom, you can see in these two depictions how the hydrogen 1s orbital will be able to overlap the sp3 hybridized orbitals of the carbon atom. And you can see we end up with 4 equivalent overlaps. We end up with an angle of 109.5 degrees, and we end up with the tetrahedral shape that we predicted. Okay, so that's what worked for methane. We needed 4 equivalent orbitals. Let's look at a different example. Let's look at the compound ethylene. Here's its structure. We have 2 carbon atoms bonded to a total of 4 hydrogen atoms. And we found from our Lewis dot structure that the carbon-carbon atom bond has to be a double bond. So once again, we have carbon with its valence electrons in the 2s and the 2p suborbitals. And we've got hydrogens with their single electron located in a 1s orbital. The Lewis dot structures and the VSEPR model predicted that we had 3 electron domains, and therefore we should have been able to generate a 120-degree angle between those domains. And that is what really takes place in an ethylene molecule. But again, the 2s and the 2p orbitals, their geometry that we learned back in quantum mechanics, we were not going to get 3 identical bonds. We're going to get 2 different overlaps again that are certainly not going to give us a 120-degree angle. This time, we don't need 4 equivalent orbitals, we need 3. And in that case, the hybridization process this time will involve a blending of the 2s orbital and 2 of the 2p orbitals. That will give us 3 equivalent orbitals, and this is called sp2 hybridization. We will have 3 sp2 orbitals. So, whenever you need a trigonal planar arrangement, sp2 hybridization will be employed. What does that look like? Well, here is a 2s orbital being hybridized with 2 2p orbitals, and you can see that generates 3 sp2 orbitals that are equivalent to each other and equally spaced at 120 degrees. Now, the thing is, it doesn't give us that double bond, so something happens here. In this diagram, we can see how we get that second bond. Now you got to remember, on the carbon, that's where the hybridization is taking place. We hybridized an s orbital, suborbital, and 2 of the 2p suborbitals. That left 1 of the 2p suborbitals untouched, unblended. And here you can see it depicted with that bilobe configuration, that figure 8, that dumbbell configuration. It allows for overlap above and below the plane of where the sp2 suborbitals were overlapping. So one of the carbon-carbon double bonds, one of them, is from a direct overlap between an sp2 orbital on one carbon atom and an sp2 orbital on a second carbon atom. That gave us one bond, but we need a second one, and you can see we get that by overlapping above and below that first bond. Now we have special designations for the kinds of overlaps and the kinds of bonds that form. When we have a direct overlap between two clouds or two orbitals, and the electrons are concentrated on that internuclear axis between the atoms, we call those sigma bonds. So you can see there's a sigma bond between the two carbon atoms. The second bond, though, the concentration of the electrons was above and below the plane, and we refer to that kind of bond as a pi bond. So the double bonded carbon atoms are the result of two kinds of bonds. A sigma bond formed from the sp2 suborbitals directly overlapping, and the second bond, referred to as a pi bond, from the remaining p orbitals on each carbon overlapping. And so you can see on one diagram, you can actually see the all the atoms bonded together and depicting them with the clouds, the electron clouds. And on the second diagram, that is more of a depiction just looking at the atoms and not really looking at the clouds. This sketch gives you more of what we saw in a previous diagram, where you have those s orbitals, 1s orbitals of hydrogens forming sigma bonds, right? Because the electrons would be concentrated between the nuclei of the hydrogen and the carbon atoms that they're bonding to. And then you see depicted in the blue and the red lobes the pi bond. Okay, so to form that double bond and to get that 120-degree angle between those pairs, we needed to utilize sp2 hybridization. Let's go to another example. Let's look at carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, obviously, CO2. If you go through the process of getting the Lewis dot structure, we see that we've got two double bonds, two carbon-oxygen double bonds. And so around that central carbon, we have two electron domains that we need to space apart. And we know that means they're going to have to be 180 degrees apart. So once again, if we go back to the orbitals or suborbitals on the carbon atom, they are in the second shell, and that would be a 2s and a 2p. The predicted 180-degree angle needs to form, but those original suborbitals we learned about in quantum mechanics is not going to allow for that 180-degree angle. And again, we won't get two, in this case, two identical bonds. So we have a third type of hybridization that takes place, and this time it's a blending of the 2s suborbital and only one of the 2p suborbitals. That gives us two equivalent sp orbitals, hybridized orbitals. We call this sp hybridization. This is used anytime you need a 180-degree angle between electron domains. Here again is what that blending looks like. The 2s and one of the 2p blends together, and you can see in pink the two equivalent sp hybridized orbitals. Okay, so now what's this going to look like when we actually form the carbon dioxide molecule? And you've got to bring an oxygen in towards that carbon atom. So here you can see what it's going to look like. You can see in the center we've got that carbon atom. The yellow lobes depict the sp hybridized orbitals. But you can see there are two pairs of bilobed suborbitals. Those are the two p orbitals that were never hybridized. So they're available to form sigma bonds, or pi bonds, I'm sorry, that's going to give us the extra carbon-oxygen bond between carbon and the two oxygens. All right, you can see on oxygen that you have a different kind of hybridization taking place because they have four pairs, and so you have a different hybridization occurring there. So we can see the green lobe of an oxygen overlapping with the yellow lobe of the carbon atom. That gives us a sigma bond. So there's one bond, carbon-oxygen bond between carbon and each of the oxygens. But we need that second bond for each of them, and that's where you get the p orbitals being available, and they overlap above and below the plane. Those are called pi bonds. And so again, the double bonds for both carbon-oxygen double bonds are the result of a sigma bond and a pi bond. Okay, now let's look at another example. So we've looked at three kinds of hybridization: sp3, sp2, sp. Which one do we use? Depends upon the kind of spacing that a particular molecule calls for to get the correct geometry. Let's look at another example, and that is phosphorus pentachloride. Here's its Lewis dot structure, so PCl5. And from our VSEPR model, we would have predicted that we would have ended up with a trigonal bipyramidal. And if you remember your bond angles correctly, we end up with three different bond angles. 90 degrees between axial and equatorial pairs, 120 degrees between equatorial pairs from each other, and 180 degrees between axial pairs. But once again, if we rely on the normal orbitals that we would expect phosphorus to have, now phosphorus is in the third period, so its valence electrons are in the third shell. Now, in the third shell, though, we've got S's and P's, and now we have also D suborbitals. And since phosphorus is allowed to have an expanded octet, we know we're going to have to employ those D orbitals somehow if we're going to accommodate the 10 electrons that are involved in those bonds. So we have a different kind of hybridization, and now it involves the 3s, all three of the 3p orbitals, and one of the 3d suborbitals or subshells for what is referred to as sp3d hybridization. And so when you need a trigonal bipyramidal arrangement, then sp3d hybridization is employed. The blending looks like this. You can see the pink 3s suborbital, the 3 grayish 3p suborbitals, and then you've got one of the 3d suborbitals, and now you end up with 5 equivalent sp3d hybridized orbitals, and they look like this. They are equivalent to one another, and they are spaced out in the angles that the VSEPR model would have predicted. And now when we bring in the chlorines, the 5 chlorine atoms, so that their clouds can overlap that of the phosphorus, you can see we don't have any hybridization occurring on the chlorines. And you can see how they overlap. And in this case, obviously, they're all sigma bonds because the electrons are concentrated on the internuclear axis between the phosphorus and each corresponding chlorine atom. And to the right, then you can see sort of the simplified version of that. And you can see our typical trigonal bipyramidal shape. All right, let's go one more. We've looked at 4 types of hybridization. Let's look at a 5th one. Let's look at what happens with sulfur hexafluoride, where now we've got 6 bonding pairs connected to the sulfur. Sulfur, again, is in the 3rd shell. So its valence electrons are in the 3s, the 3p, and the 3d suborbitals or subshells. Remember now, Vesper would have predicted that this shape that you see here, called an octahedron, gives us angles of 90 and 180 degrees. But once again, if we use regular suborbitals, sp and d suborbitals, we would not get equivalent spacing and we would not get the correct angles. So once more, hybridization will be employed. And this time we're going to mathematically combine 3s, 3ps, and 2 of the 3d for 6 equivalent orbitals. This is called sp3d2 hybridization, and it is employed anytime you need an octahedral arrangement of pairs of electrons. Okay, and this is showing you, depicting it using our electron configuration notation of what's taking place. Okay, and you can see how the S, the 3s, and the 3p's, along with the 3d, are blended as they are mathematically combined. And in your far right pane, you actually see the hybridized sp3d2 hybrid orbitals. Here's what it would look like when we've got the clouds actually drawn in. You can see sort of that JAX kind of configuration in diagram A, and diagram B actually shows you those sp3d2 suborbitals. And then finally, the actual molecule is going to look something like this. And you can see the overlap. And again, you can see those sigma bonds formed between the sulfur and the 6 fluorines that it's bonded to. So that's what hybridization is about. We're trying to look at the orbitals that we learned about, the electron clouds that we learned about in quantum mechanics, and we've got to get them to coincide and dovetail with what we've learned about from the Lewis dot structures and then ultimately the Vesper model, so that we get the correct geometry that is predicted and then is an actual constructed, in real life, that these are what the molecules truly do look like, and these are the spacings that exist. That is hybridization.